Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 28th of March of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. We can say that today we have at least 5 confirmations about the advance of Russian forces on the territory of Ukraine, and the most important are coming from the Donbas front line. Now let's start from Bakhmut. The Russians are saying that as a result of clashes and storm operation in the central part of Bakhmut, they managed to develop their bridgehead on the north part of Bakhmut industrial zone and in the south part of Bakhmut. If we take a look at this map has been already updated, and as you can see, the Russians have almost established 100% control over the industrial zone. There are few residential area, few blocks, and few civilians area in the south of this industrial area, and furthermore the Russians managed to develop their bridgehead in the vicinity of the marketplace and in the vicinity of school number 5. If we take a look at the central map, central part of Bakhmut, you see that the main forces that are located here and try to fight with the Russians is the forces from the foreign legions, like Chechensky battalions or brigades, or Belarus or Georgian battalions, and so on. The national battalions, national Ukrainian forces, are deployed in the western part of Bakhmut. They're prepared, the bridgehead, they're prepared for fortifications. I'm not sure that the forces that located in the central part of Bakhmut is highly motivated to continue clashes, so I believe that very soon this bridgehead will be left by the Ukrainian forces, and then we're going to move to the western part of Bakhmut. This is about Bakhmut. Furthermore, the Russian sources are saying that there are very heavy clashes and some artillery duels on the northern part of Bakhmut bridgehead in the vicinity of Zaliznyánska between Privilye, Makeyevka, Orekhovo-Vasilievka, Zaliznyánska, Dubovo-Vasilievka. The Russians attacked the Ukrainian forces on the road between these two areas. The Ukrainians currently are trying to collect and accumulate some forces, and they start doing some kind of reco and combo. They start doing some process to connect parts of forces in this area. The Russians, of course, controls and see everything, and they try to attack the Ukrainians while they're moving on the ground and among the fields and so on. I'm not expecting that the Russians are going to develop the bridgehead. The only possible movement during this week, maybe the Russians would try to attack in direction Minkovka, according to some sources that provided this information in the end of the previous week. Now let's move to Avdiivka. As you can see, there are also a lot of icons saying that there are very heavy clashes in this area. The Russians are saying that as a result of storm operation in the north of Avdiivka, they managed to establish control over more territories, to develop the bridgehead along the railroad. They managed to get few prisoners of war from the Ukrainian side. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that they had some progress in the south of in the Pesky front line. They continued their offensive operation along Pervomayskaya village, and as a result of those clashes, they managed to establish control and have almost reached the end or outskirts of this water reservoir. Let's take a look at this map. This map shows the current progress. So this is Pervomayskaya, and this is the water reservoir, and as you can see, the Russians is on the edge of this corner of this water reservoir, and there is just small street left, and very soon they are going to be able to get the road that connects Nivoysk and Pervomaysk. Now the Russians are going to attack from the north side, from the south side, and they need to push the Ukrainians back with one purpose: to establish control over Nivoysk. When talking about the north of Bakhmut, north of Avdiivka, there are no progress in this area. The only interesting piece of information is coming from the Western sources map. As you can see, this map shows that there are very significant bridgehead in this area. Furthermore, some Western sources, including the Institute of Study of War, confirms that as a result of clashes during the previous days, the Russians managed to establish control over Novokalinovo. So we can say that this information partly confirmed. Now there is just one question: whether the Russians are planning to develop this bridgehead, or they establish control over these towns and settlements just with one purpose: to allow the Russians to develop the bridgehead in Krasnogorovka, Novobakhmutovka, and as soon as they're able to do this, they will step back from this area. So a lot of questions. I believe that If you ask me, I believe that after I analyzed this area for some period, for some days, I understood that this is the most important bridgehead in this area, and we see that during the previous we can say that the Russians managed to encircle, or at least to establish this configuration of the front line around Avdiivka something like 2 weeks ago, and since that period of time they still haven't managed to encircle or to close this hat between these two, like clouds from the south or from the north. And if the Russians are able to do this, we can say about the encirclement of entire Avdiivka. But the Russians still haven't done this, haven't completed this mission, and they need to do this because there are still some safe road that Ukrainians are able to use, of course, under fire, under artillery fire, but they can do some kind of make rotation process to move supplies, to get wounded personnel from Avdiivka and so on. And this is the headache, because the northern bridgehead is very poor about when talking about the quality of this area, because the Ukrainians do have possibilities to start counteroffensive in this area and to push the Russians back from this bridgehead. I'm not sure, and I don't know why they still haven't done this, maybe because of the lack of reserves that currently are located in the vicinity of Bakhmut. But if the Ukrainians take a strategical decision, and find some reserves and send them here, of course they have a lot of chances to push the Russians back. And now let's analyze this area, and let's try to discuss, and let's try to understand what the Russians are going to do here. First of all, when talking about the operation of final encirclement of Avdiivka, as we discussed, the Russians need to connect these two clouds somewhere along this line. But there are two problems. When talking about the south area, all these towns like Toninkino, Lastочкино, Orlovka, Semenovka, Berdichi is completely fortified. We can find this information on the Russian sources map. There are a lot of trenches in this area. These towns is fortified themselves, and the Ukrainians, after the Russians established control of the Piesky front line, they had a lot of time to prepare these towns. So that's why to move from the south to the north is very dangerous. Furthermore, all these fields are mined, and the Russians need to spend a lot of time to understand where they are able to use the safe roads to move to the north. And when talking about the north part, there are no problems with this, because the Ukrainians they didn't suppose and they didn't expect that the Russians are able to create such a salient on the north of Avdiivka. So this territory is less fortified in comparison with the south area. But there are two problems in this area for the Russians, two barriers, and I'm talking about the railroad that goes from Achertin in direction of Novobakhmutovka and from Achertin in direction of Avdiivka. And this is a very powerful and very big, painful barrier for the Russians. And the problem is that if the Russians want to continue encirclement operation of Avdiivka, they need to have support from armored vehicles. So usually when the Russians attacks or storm operation on Donbas front line, first they're sending tanks, 2 or 3 tanks that using their ammo and shells, they attack in the Ukrainian fortifications. Of course, before that they're using air bombs and artillery systems. Then they're sending tanks, and as soon as tanks are doing their job, they're sending armored vehicles with the stormtroopers, and after that stormtroopers establish control over these or that trenches. And this railroad is a very big problem for the Russians, because it is very difficult to cross this railroad with tanks and armored vehicles for many reasons, and technically it's not an easy job, and it takes more time, and these railroads of course is under fire control, and every second, every minute can cost a lot of lives during the offensive operation. Furthermore, you need to accumulate some forces, you need to find a way where you can cross these railroads, and after that you are able to start storming of Berdichi or these towns between these on this neck. So, and if we are talking about, let's say, Keramik, as according to the Institute of Study of Wars and more Western sources, this town is already in Russian control. There is no such a problem, because the Russians are able to send their tanks and armored vehicles through Novobakhmutovka, through this cross, through this interception, and after that they can find their tanks in Novokalinovo, in this town. So there are no problems to accumulate and collect forces in the vicinity of Novokalinovo. That means that, and currently the Institute of Study of Wars and Western sources are saying that the Russians, after taking control over this town, are doing some kind of accumulation process. They're sending reserves, they're moving manpower, then they try to analyze and figure out what to do next. So as I understand, and I expect that the next week or maybe this week the Russians are going to activate this small salient and to start their movements in direction of Vachertina, and after that in direction of Arkhangelsk. So the Russians will try to develop this bridgehead, and if the Russians are able to establish control over the small railroad station Archertina, this one, of course, the Russians will be able to reduce the logistic possibilities of Ukrainian army, and the most important, there is a lot of places where the Russians are able to cross the railroad and to accumulate their forces on the south part of Archertina, and after that the Russians will be able to start their movements to the south from this area, let's say in direction of Novobakhmutovka, Berdych and Semenovka. So by this attack, by this development, the Russians are able to encircle and to complete encirclement process on Avdiivka without attacking this fortification area between Berdych, Semenovka, Orlovka, Lastочкина. And to compare these two operations, I believe that the northern operation of attack in direction of Archertina is less difficult in comparison with this one. And the reason is that the Russians are able to use their armored vehicle fists, their tanks, to attack in this area. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 240 soldiers, 12 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system D-30 on Donetsk front line from Avdiivka to Bakhmut. I'm not sure that the number of losses of Ukrainians in Bakhmut were included in that number, because this is the area of responsibility of Wagner's, and I believe that maybe they are not sharing the numbers, or maybe the Ministry of Defense are not including the numbers of losses of Ukrainians that were dealt by the private military companies. Another interesting piece of information coming of Avdiivka, if you remember the previous 2 days, the Institute of Study of War were saying that, first they were saying that Wagner's took a decision, or the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation took a decision to redeploy some groups of Wagnerians in direction of Avdiivka to help the Russian forces to improve the bridgehead and to complete the encirclement operation of Avdiivka. Yesterday, the Institute reported that the Wagnerians are already there and they're doing this job. And today, the Russian sources, some Russian press units ask questions. Prigozhin, the head of Wagner's, whether there are some forces in Avdiivka, Wagner forces or not. And Prigozhin told us that there are no Wagnerians in the vicinity of Avdiivka, just the regular Russian army in the vicinity of this town. He told us that he was not going to send any forces there, so we understand that maybe for some reason or Prigozhin is going to hide some information and not to make some kind of disclaimers and not to tell the secret type of info, or the Institute of Study of War were speculating on this on the basis of this information during the previous days. Very interesting. We are going to understand this very soon, I believe so. And of course, when talking about the south part, as we discussed, according to latest information we have, the Russians controls this part of Pervomayskaya and the northern bridgehead of Pesky, and of course the main corner, the main interception, the main area that the Russians need to establish control over is this blue cloud. The Russians need to get control over this town with one purpose. They will be able to cut the road that connects Nivolskaya and Bakhmut and Pervomayskaya. And after that, the Ukrainians will lose a very powerful artillery positions that they have on the west part of Nivolskaya that the Ukrainians are using to attack the Russian forces who try to attack Marinka, Novomikhailovka, and of course the Russian forces who tries to advance in this north of Pesky front line. This is a very important artillery position, very close to the combat line, and this is a very big pain in Russian plans, so that's why they need to focus in this area as well. Furthermore, a lot of sources are saying that the Russians continue reducing the gray zone between Krasnogorovka and Staromikhailovka, and they're trying to show us, or they're trying to make us to believe that the Russians are going to start the storming process of Krasnogorovka. It's a very difficult decision, to tell the truth, if the Russians took such kind of decision, because it's going to be another bloody operation with heaviest losses from the Russian side, the same as in Marinka and Peski. Very difficult. To tell the truth, I don't believe that the Russians are going to do this, but maybe maybe they have some kind of plan, or maybe they're going to use their guided bombs more often or something like this. Another advance that we were talking about, advances are coming from Liman front line, and this information confirmed by many maps like Deep State, like Russian sources map, and so on. And the Russians are pushing in direction of Tarskoye and this area, and they have already got the outskirts of this small village. And this is a very small village, but anyway, this bridgehead, the Ukrainians uses this bridgehead to supply and support their forces from Liman in Kremenaya and in Yampolovka. And so this is the progress. Not much information we can find in the open source, but anyway, the only fact that they're moving in this direction. The Russians are saying that the result of clashes on Liman front line during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 125 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system Gvozdika. There are very heavy clashes as well. As you can see, the level of losses is very high. After small operational pause, the Russians restored the pressure and continued their movements in this direction. When talking about Kupiansk front line, the picture is the same as we saw yesterday and the day before yesterday, without any changes on the ground. The Russians are saying that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 65 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles, and there were no artillery duels, or the previous artillery duels wasn't very effective from the Russian side. Now let's go to the South Donetsk and Zaporozhye area. There are no changes on the ground. The only important update is that the Russians took a decision to change the head of the army in this area, who's responsible for Zaporozhye and South Donetsk area. We discussed this in my previous 2 videos. I'll remind you one more time that the Russians took a decision to adopt to appoint General Kuzmenko on this position. From 2015 till 2019, he was the head of the 6th Russian Army. And after that, till the beginning of the special military operation, he was a teacher in Russian General Staff Academy. So as you can see, he is very experienced when talking about his experience of when he was the head of commander of the 6th Army, and he also is very educated when talking about the fact that he is, let's say, he's doctor in military science, we can say, because he was a teacher in the most powerful, most important military academy of Russian Federation. So he is the man of science and man of practice as well. So we'll see whether he's able to change the situation in the South Donetsk area and in Zaporozhye, because as we discussed, these are two completely different types of front line. When talking about Zaporozhye, the Russians need to defeat the Ukrainians and to move the bridgehead to the north, because as we know, as we discussed, the Ukrainians are using their HIMARS rocket to attack Melitopol, and the distance is around 80 kilometers, so they are able to do this. And we know that the Russians need to push the Ukrainians at least, and to have some kind of distance in 100 kilometers between these two areas. So that's why the Russians need to push the Ukrainians, let's say, from if they want to secure Melitopol, exactly to this river or to the north of Kamyshovakha. So anyway, no matter whether the Russians are going to take control over Zaporozhye or not, if they're planning to, if this war is going to be continued for more than 1 year, the intensivity of missiles attack in direction of Melitopol will be increased, and of course the Russians need to push the Ukrainians, and for these purposes they need to take Orekh, Guliapole. And now this task is completely on the shoulders of this new General Kuzmenko. You know that this is very interesting, and from my side, some of the people think that if the Russians change their generals, that means that they have big problems in the military authorities and their general staff and so on. But I'll give you my opinion. I see that the Russians, when changing generals, they're trying to adopt young people on this position with the fresh ideas, fresh brains, fresh ideas, and experienced guys. So I'm completely for this process because when talking about the Ukrainians, as you can see, since the beginning of the special military operation, I don't remember if they have changed any of general on the front line. Yes, of course, there was some regular losses in Ukrainian army, and it was some kind of exchange process as a result of losses among the general staff or something like this. But even when talking about Bakhmut, that is under responsibility of commander of infantry army Syrsky, he was responsible for the same operation in Debaltsevo, where he got Cauldron, and now he has almost got Cauldron in Bakhmut. So you can see the process in Ukraine army is less mobile and flexible in comparison with the Russians. And this is we see that when talking about the Russians, they have some competition in military authorities. And of course, always, if you want to have progress, you need to create some kind of atmosphere where people can compete. And this allows the best of the people to get the best positions and to show themselves. And I see that the Russians give such opportunity, they create such a structure when they give possibilities to young generals and officers to take position and to take situation in their hand. We'll see whether it's going to give us, the Russians, some progress or not, or result. And when talking about Kherson area, the Russians reported that as a result of artillery duels in this area, the Ukrainians lost 18 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. And when talking about South Donetsk and Zaporozhye, the Ukrainians lost 20 soldiers and 3 armored vehicles. So as you can see, the level of losses is very low on these both front lines. Maybe this situation is connected with this changing process, while one commander takes the position of another. And of course, during this period of time, maybe the Russians are less active on the front lines. Anyway, I believe that as soon as this information will be confirmed, I believe that the Russians will start doing something with new general on the south of Ukraine. Furthermore, I believe and I expect that soon we are going to see some activation on the Kupiansk front line, because as we can see, the Russians managed to completely reduce any activity from the Ukrainian side in this area. So we can say that the Ukrainians are completely suppressed and blocked in Kupiansk front line. So that means that the first stage of what the Russians should do in this front line have already completed, and now they need to turn their active defense their active defense operations into complete offensive operation, and to start pushing the Ukrainians from this area as well. We'll see whether they're able to do this or not. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you that we condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.